Verity by Colleen Hoover. Welcome to VideoBooks' YouTube channel. Listen to the complete audiobook summary of Verity by Colleen Hoover. Before we start the audiobook, make sure to subscribe to our channel to get long book summaries for free. Verity by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 1. The first chapter of Verity by Colleen Hoover wastes no time in establishing the unsettling, visceral tone that permeates the entire psychological thriller. The story begins in Manhattan, where the protagonist, Lowen Ashley, is standing at a crosswalk, already feeling the weight of her struggling career as a mid-list author and the recent death of her mother. The atmosphere shifts from mundane to macabre in an instant, when a man in front of her steps into the street and is violently struck by a truck. The description is unflinching. Lowen is sprayed with the man's blood, a traumatic event that leaves her physically and mentally reeling. In the chaotic aftermath, a stranger named Jeremy Crawford steps in to help her. He takes her into a nearby building to help her clean the blood off her clothes, showing a level of kindness and composure that stands in stark contrast to the gore they just witnessed. There is an immediate, heavy tension between them, not just from the trauma, but from a deep, unspoken magnetic pull. Jeremy even gives her his own shirt to wear so she doesn't have to stay in her blood-stained clothes. This encounter is brief, but intense, leaving Lowen shaken by both the accident and the mysterious man who assisted her. Shortly after this ordeal, Lowen arrives at a high-stakes meeting with her literary agent Corey. She is desperate for work, as she is facing eviction and her bank account is nearly empty. To her absolute shock, Jeremy Crawford is sitting in the office. It is revealed that he isn't just a helpful stranger. He is the husband of Verity Crawford, a world-famous, best-selling author. Corey explains the reason for the meeting. Verity has been involved in a devastating car accident that has left her unable to finish her highly successful book series. Jeremy is looking for a co-author to step in and complete the final 3 novels. The chapter dives into Lowen's internal conflict. She suffers from severe social anxiety and prefers the anonymity of being a writer who stays out of the spotlight, which makes the prospect of taking over a series for a literary icon like Verity Crawford feel terrifying. However, the financial offer is life-changing. Enough money to solve all her immediate problems and then some. Jeremy advocates for her, revealing that he chose her because he appreciates the grit and honesty in her previous writing, which he feels aligns with Verity's dark style. The chapter ends with Lowen accepting the offer, though she feels a lingering sense of dread. She agrees to move into the Crawford home for a few weeks to go through Verity's chaotic office and research her notes to ensure the transition between authors is seamless. As she prepares to enter the private world of a woman she has never met, a woman who is now a ghost of her former self, the narrative sets up the central mystery. The blood on her shirt at the beginning of the chapter serves as a dark omen for the secrets she is about to uncover within the walls of the Crawford estate. Verity by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 2. In the second chapter of Verity, the tone shifts from the visceral shock of the Manhattan streets to a slow-burning Gothic unease. Lowen Ashley arrives at the Crawford estate in Vermont, a massive, secluded home that feels more like a fortress than a residence. The house is shrouded in an atmosphere of grief and stagnant air, situated near a lake that carries its own dark history. It's the site where the Crawfords' twin daughters, Chastine and Harper, tragically died in separate incidents within months of each other. Upon entering, Lowen is immediately struck by the silence of the house, which is broken only by the clinical sounds of medical equipment. Jeremy welcomes her, but he is clearly a man hollowed out by tragedy. He introduces Lowen to the reality of their daily life. Verity is physically present but mentally absent, living in a hospital bed in a downstairs room, unresponsive and staring blankly into space. The sight of the once prolific author reduced to a catatonic state is deeply unsettling for Lowen, who feels like an intruder in a tomb of secrets. The chapter introduces the youngest Crawford child, Crew, a young boy who seems remarkably resilient despite the horrors his family has endured. However, there is an edge to his behavior that hints at the trauma beneath the surface. As Jeremy shows Lowen to her room and eventually to Verity's office, the work ahead of her takes on a daunting weight. The office is a chaotic tomb of Verity's career. Stacks of notes, half-finished outlines, and research materials that feel overwhelmingly intimate. The psychological tension spikes when Lowen begins to explore the office alone. She describes a sensation of being watched, a feeling that the house itself is rejecting her presence. As she sifts through the files, she realizes that Verity's writing process was far darker and more immersive than she had imagined. The chapter establishes a chilling dynamic. Lowen is there to become Verity for the sake of the books, but the more she uncovers about the woman's mind, the more she fears what she might find. The chapter ends with Lowen settling into her first night at the house. The isolation of the Vermont woods and the knowledge that a living ghost is resting just floors away sets the stage for the paranoia that will soon consume her. She realizes that Jeremy is her only ally in this house, yet even his kindness begins to feel like a fragile shield against the oppressive history of the Crawfords. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 3. In the third chapter of Verity, Lowen begins her first full day of work, and the domestic setting of the Crawford house starts to feel increasingly like a psychological trap. The morning brings a deeper look at the strained family dynamics and the heavy toll of Verity's condition on Jeremy. As Lowen tries to settle into a routine, she observes the meticulous and heartbreaking care Jeremy provides for his unresponsive wife. This creates a conflicting sense of admiration and attraction in Lowen. She is drawn to Jeremy's devotion, yet she feels a growing sense of guilt for being a healthy, able-bodied woman intruding on their tragedy. The bulk of the chapter takes place within the confines of Verity's home office. The room is a cluttered sanctuary of the macabre, filled with the research materials for Verity's Villains series, a collection of books written entirely from the perspective of the antagonist. As Lowen begins the painstaking process of organizing the chaos, she finds herself overwhelmed by the darkness of Verity's creative mind. The notes are cold and clinical, revealing a woman who is obsessed with the darker impulses of the human psyche. Lowen struggles with the imposter syndrome of trying to mimic such a distinct and disturbing voice, feeling that she is peeling back layers of a soul she was never meant to see. The atmosphere in the office is thick with tension. Lowen continues to experience the sensation of being observed, often glancing toward the doorway or the shadows in the corner. Her paranoia is amplified by the presence of Crew, who wanders the halls with an eerie quietness. There is a moment where she interacts with the boy, and his casual acceptance of his mother's state and his sister's deaths sends a chill through her. It becomes clear that the entire Crawford family is living in a state of arrested development, frozen in the trauma of their past. The turning point of the chapter occurs when Lowen finds a hidden manuscript tucked away in a place where it shouldn't be. It isn't an outline for the series she was hired to finish. It's an autobiography titled, So Be It. Against her better judgment, Lowen begins to read the first few pages. Unlike the polished, professional tone of Verity's novels, this writing is raw, visceral, and terrifyingly honest. The narrative voice in the autobiography is chillingly different from the loving mother and wife persona Jeremy has described. The chapter ends with Lowen gripped by a new kind of fear. She realizes that this manuscript was never meant for the public eye, and as the sun sets over the Vermont woods, the house feels more claustrophobic than ever. She is no longer just a ghostwriter. She has become a voyeur into the potentially sociopathic mind of the woman sleeping downstairs. The final lines of the chapter leave Lowen and the reader wondering if the real Verity is the one in the hospital bed or the one hidden in the pages of the secret manuscript. Verity, by Colleen Hoover, Chapter 4. In the fourth chapter of Verity, the narrative structure shifts as Lowen retreats to her room and begins to consume the secret autobiography, So Be It. This chapter marks the beginning of the story within a story, as the perspective alternates between Lowen's mounting terror in the present and Verity's chillingly cold recollections of the past. As Lowen reads, she realizes that this isn't a typical memoir. It is a confession written with a level of detachment that suggests a total lack of maternal instinct or empathy. The content of the manuscript focuses on the early days of Verity and Jeremy's relationship and the subsequent birth of their twin daughters. Verity describes her attraction to Jeremy as an all-consuming, almost predatory obsession. She views her children not as blessings, but as intruders who stole Jeremy's attention away from her. The prose in the autobiography is sharp and unapologetic, detailing Verity's resentment toward the pregnancy and her deliberate attempts to remain disconnected from the girls. Lowen is horrified to read that Verity viewed her own daughters as rivals for Jeremy's affection from the moment they were born. Interspersed with these dark revelations are Lowen's real-time reactions within the Crawford house. Every creak of the floorboards or shadow in the hallway makes her jump, as the boundary between the woman in the manuscript and the woman in the hospital bed downstairs begins to blur. Lowen's physical attraction to Jeremy continues to grow, fueled by the contrast between the loving husband she sees and the preyed-upon man described in Verity's writing. She feels a desperate urge to protect Jeremy from the truth of who his wife actually is. Yet she is paralyzed by the realization that she is essentially living with a monster. A particularly disturbing moment occurs when Lowen takes a break from reading and encounters Verity in her medical bed. As she looks at the motionless woman, Lowen finds herself searching for any sign of the malice she just read about on the page. She begins to wonder if Verity is truly catatonic, or if she is performing one final, masterful act of manipulation. This paranoia is heightened when Lowen notices small, inexplicable details in the house. A door that was closed but is now ajar, or a brief glimpse of a figure in a window that suggests she might not be as alone in the hallways as she thinks. The chapter ends on a note of psychological exhaustion. Lowen is trapped in a loop of morbid curiosity. She is repulsed by Verity's words, yet she cannot stop reading. She realizes that the manuscript is a weapon, and she is now the only person who knows the potential danger the Crawfords are in. As she hides the pages under her bed, the silence of the Vermont woods feels like a threat, and Lowen begins to understand that in this house, the truth is far more dangerous than any fiction. So Be It, Chapter 1. The first So Be It manuscript entry. This subchapter is where the mask truly slips. It isn't a story about a woman struggling with motherhood. It is a clinical look at a woman who views her life as a series of power plays. Verity writes about the beginning of her relationship with Jeremy with a chilling level of honesty. She admits that she didn't just love him, she wanted to own him. She describes their physical connection in raw, almost animalistic terms, making it clear that Jeremy was the sun in her universe, and she would destroy anything that cast a shadow on her time with him. The most horrifying part of this entry is Verity's reaction to her first pregnancy. Most authors would describe the fear or excitement of new motherhood, but Verity describes the twins, Harper and Chastin, as parasites. She admits to trying to induce a miscarriage by drinking excessive amounts of caffeine and making reckless physical choices, hoping her body would reject the invaders. She views the growing life inside her as a physical threat to her body, and more importantly, a threat to the undivided attention she received from Jeremy. The prose in this section is deliberately uncomfortable. Verity recounts the birth of the twins not as a miracle, but as a day she lost her grip on Jeremy. She describes the immediate jealousy she felt when she saw Jeremy holding the girls, realizing that his heart was now divided. This entry establishes the villain voice that Lowen was hired to mimic, but with one terrifying difference. This isn't fiction. For Lowen, reading this is like watching a car crash in slow motion. She is looking for a reason to sympathize with the woman downstairs, but all she finds is a woman who resented her children from the moment of conception. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 5. In Chapter 5, the psychological weight of the So Be It manuscript begins to manifest as physical illness for Lowen. After spending the night absorbing Verity's dark confessions, Lowen wakes up in the Crawford house, feeling a deep sense of hangover from the prose. The air in the house feels thicker, more stagnant, and she finds herself hyper-aware of every sound echoing through the vents. This chapter is defined by Lowen's transition from a curious observer to a woman consumed by a terrifying, growing paranoia. She is no longer just a ghostwriter. She is a woman who feels she is being hunted in a house of tragedies. The morning starts with Lowen attempting to maintain a facade of normalcy. She joins Jeremy and crew for breakfast, but the experience is jarring. Watching Jeremy interact with his son, showing the gentle, attentive parenting that Verity so clearly resented in her writing, makes Lowen's stomach churn. She looks at Jeremy and sees a man who has been profoundly betrayed. Yet he is entirely unaware of the monster he is harboring in the downstairs bedroom. Lowen's attraction to him is now laced with a protective instinct, but it is also complicated by the truth she holds. She feels like she is vibrating with the secret, and the more Jeremy treats her with kindness, the more she feels like a co-conspirator in his misery. The central conflict of this chapter revolves around Lowen's increasing suspicion that Verity is faking her catatonic state. While Jeremy is busy elsewhere in the house, Lowen finds herself drawn back to the area near Verity's room. She begins to perform small tests to see if she can catch Verity in a slip-up. The tension in these scenes is suffocating. Lowen describes the way Verity's eyes seem to have a dull, glassy sheen that feels almost too perfect. At one point, Lowen is convinced she sees a slight twitch in Verity's finger or a shift in her gaze that suggests she is tracking Lowen's movements. This isn't just a medical condition anymore. To Lowen, it starts to feel like a predatory crouch. The paranoia reaches a breaking point during a moment when Lowen is alone in the upstairs hallway. She looks down the long corridor toward the master bedroom and sees a figure. For a split second, she is certain it is Verity standing there, upright, mobile, and watching her. Her heart stops, but when she blinks or moves closer, the figure is gone, or it turns out to be a trick of the light and shadows. This gaslighting of her own senses is a major theme in this chapter. Lowen begins to question if the manuscript is actually making her lose her mind, or if the house is truly haunted by a woman who refuses to die. Lowen's professional work in the office becomes almost impossible. She tries to focus on the outlines for the Villains series, but her mind keeps drifting back to the hidden autobiography. She finds herself constantly checking the door, locking it when she's inside, and jumping at the slightest sound of Crew's footsteps. The chapter emphasizes her isolation. She can't call her agent and explain the situation because she sounds like a conspiracy theorist, and she can't talk to Jeremy without destroying his life. She is trapped in a house with a man she desires, a child she pities, and a woman she is beginning to believe is a cold-blooded killer. The chapter ends with a chilling encounter that solidifies Lowen's fear. While Jeremy is outside, Lowen passes by the nursery, the room that belonged to the deceased twins. She hears a faint sound, like a rhythmic tapping or a soft breath, coming from inside. When she investigates, The room is empty, but the feeling of a malevolent presence is so strong that she flees back to her own room. She realizes that she cannot stop reading the manuscript. Even though it is poisoning her mind, it is the only map she has to navigate the danger of the Crawford family. She retrieves the pages from their hiding spot, her hands shaking, knowing that whatever comes next in Verity's confession will likely be the end of her own peace of mind. So Be It, Chapter 2. In this second installment of the So Be It manuscript, the narrative takes a sharp turn from resentment into what can only be described as psychological horror. This section is perhaps one of the most infamous in the book, as it details the birth and early infancy of the twins, Harper and Chastin, through Verity's chillingly detached perspective. Verity doesn't describe the new baby smell or the joy of a first smile. Instead, she describes the physical toll of breastfeeding and the way the infant's constant demands felt like an assault on her body and her marriage. The core of this entry focuses on Verity's growing obsession with Jeremy's reaction to the girls. She notes with surgical precision how his attention shifted. To Verity, every moment Jeremy spent comforting a crying baby was a moment he was neglecting her. She recounts a specific, horrifying incident when the twins were still infants. They were crying relentlessly and Jeremy was exhausted. Verity describes watching him sleep while the babies screamed, feeling a surge of power in the fact that she was the only one awake to witness the chaos. The accidental theme begins here with a terrifying story involving a coat hanger. Verity writes about a moment when she was alone with the babies and felt a total break from reality, or perhaps a total embrace of her darkest impulses. She describes a test she performed, wondering how much it would take to make the crying stop permanently. While she doesn't follow through with a fatal act in this specific scene, the way she describes the urge to do so is enough to make Lowen and the reader physically ill. It establishes that Verity wasn't just a bad mother. She was a woman who viewed her children's lives as variables she could manipulate to see how Jeremy would react. As the twins grow into toddlers, Verity's tests become more sophisticated. She describes the first major accident involving Harper. According to the public story Jeremy believes, it was a tragic mishap. But in the manuscript, Verity reveals a much more sinister truth. She describes a moment of discipline that went too far, or perhaps exactly as far as she secretly intended. She writes about the fear in the child's eyes with a sense of clinical curiosity rather than remorse. She isn't worried about the child's safety. She is worried about how to frame the event so that Jeremy will see her as a grieving, heroic mother rather than the source of the trauma. The entry concludes with Verity reflecting on the success of her manipulation. She realizes that by being the one to find the injured child or save the day, she earns a specific type of devoted, protective love from Jeremy. She learns that tragedy is a tool. If she can't have Jeremy's attention through love, she will have it through shared grief. This realization sets the stage for the deaths of the daughters later on. For Lowen, reading this is a transformative experience. She realizes she isn't just reading a diary. She is reading the blueprint of a sociopath who used her own children as pawns to keep her husband close. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 6. Chapter 6. The psychological barrier between the fictional horror of the manuscript and Lowen's reality in the Crawford house completely evaporates. Lowen wakes up in a state of high alert, her mind stuck on the image of Verity using a coat hanger to test her infant's survival instincts. The house, which previously felt merely sad, now feels predatory. Every time Lowen walks past Verity's closed door, she feels a physical prickle on her skin, a primitive fight-or-flight response that tells her she is in the presence of an apex predator. The morning begins with a scene that highlights Lowen's deteriorating mental state. She finds herself obsessively watching the baby monitor that Jeremy uses to keep an ear on Verity. To anyone else, the static and the occasional rustle of sheets are normal sounds of a bedridden patient. To Lowen, they sound like a woman waiting for the right moment to strike. She spends a significant portion of the morning paralyzed, staring at the screen, convinced that if she blinks, she will miss Verity sitting up and looking directly into the camera. When Lowen finally gathers the courage to leave her room, she encounters Jeremy in the kitchen. The contrast between the Jeremy she sees, warm, grieving, and hands-on with Crew, and the Jeremy portrayed in the manuscript, a man whose love was a prize to be won through blood and tragedy, is almost too much for her to bear. They share a moment of domestic intimacy while making coffee, and the sexual tension between them is now heavily laced with Lowen's desperation. She wants to crawl into his skin, not just because she's attracted to him, but because she feels he is the only safe harbor in a house filled with ghosts. However, she is haunted by the thought that by being attracted to him, she is falling exactly into the trap Verity described, being consumed by the Jeremy Crawford effect. The centerpiece of this chapter is the trash can discovery. While Jeremy is occupied with Crew, Lowen finds herself in the laundry room or near the waste bins, driven by a morbid, investigative impulse. She finds a discarded item, a piece of food or a used napkin, that shouldn't be there. Specifically, she finds evidence that suggests someone has been eating or moving in a way a catatonic person shouldn't be able to. She finds a used toothpick or a piece of chewed-up food that looks suspiciously like it was discarded by someone with full motor control. This discovery sends her into a tailspin. She begins to calculate the logistics. How does Verity go to the bathroom? How does she eat when the nurses aren't looking? The realization that Jeremy might be living with a woman who is performing her disability is a horror beyond anything Lowen has ever written. Later in the chapter, Lowen's paranoia leads her to a direct, silent confrontation. She finds herself standing in the doorway of Verity's room while the nurse is away. She stands there for what feels like hours, watching Verity's chest rise and fall. In a moment of pure, reckless terror, Lowen decides to provoke a reaction. She says something, or makes a sudden movement, intended to startle a faking person. Verity doesn't flinch, but the vibe in the room shifts. Lowen describes the air as feeling charged, as if Verity is using every ounce of her formidable will to remain still. Lowen leaves the room shaking, more convinced than ever that Verity is faking, but even more terrified because it means Verity is a master of self-control. The chapter ends with Lowen retreating to the office, but she can no longer focus on the villains series. The line between Verity's books and Verity's life has been erased. Lowen realizes that she is now a character in one of Verity's stories, and in Verity's world, the villain always wins because they are willing to do what the hero won't. As night falls and the Vermont woods go dark, Lowen locks her bedroom door and pushes a chair against the handle. She retrieves the manuscript again, needing to know more, even though every word feels like a nail in her own coffin. She has to know what happened to the twins, because she is starting to believe that she is the next nuisance Verity needs to eliminate. So be it. Chapter 3. In this third installment of the So Be It manuscript, the narrative moves from the general resentment of motherhood into the specific, calculated orchestration of a household ruled by Verity's whims. This section focuses heavily on the birth of their son, Crew, and the atmospheric shift in the house as the twins, Harper and Chastine, grow old enough to have their own personalities, and, consequently, old enough to truly get in Verity's way. Verity describes the pregnancy with Crew as a tactical maneuver. Unlike her feelings toward the twins, whom she viewed as accidents that stole Jeremy's time, she describes Crew as a replacement or a tether. She admits that she wanted a third child specifically to reset the dynamic of the house, and to ensure Jeremy stayed tethered to her through a new infancy. However, once Crew is born, the parasite narrative returns. Verity writes about the physical act of nursing Crew with a chilling detachment, viewing him as a mouth that literally drains the life out of her, leaving her with less energy to perform the role of the perfect wife for Jeremy. The most disturbing part of this entry is how Verity describes her relationship with the twins during this period. She details a series of disciplinary methods that border on psychological torture. She writes about teaching the girls to be afraid of things, the water, the woods, the stairs, not out of a desire for their safety, but to make them easier to control and to keep them away from her and Jeremy's private spaces. She recounts a specific moment where she intentionally let one of the girls wander toward a dangerous situation just to see how long it would take for the child to realize she was alone and unprotected. Verity watches these moments like a scientist observing a lab rat, noting the child's terror with zero emotional resonance. This entry also provides a deeper look at the accidents that Jeremy believed were just strokes of bad luck. Verity describes the first incident with one of the twins in agonizing, cold detail. She explains how she manipulated the environment, perhaps a slippery floor or a precarious toy, and then simply waited. She writes about the beauty of the chaos that follows a childhood injury, the way Jeremy rushes home, the way he clings to Verity for support, and the way the tragedy forces them into an intimate, shared bubble. For Verity, a hurt child is a small price to pay for a husband who is once again looking at her with total, desperate focus. The prose in this section becomes increasingly rhythmic and hypnotic, reflecting Verity's deepening sociopathy. She starts to justify her actions by claiming that she is testing her children's survival instincts, arguing that if they were meant to survive, they would be smarter or more cautious. It is a twisted form of social Darwinism applied to her own nursery. She even admits to feeling a sense of disappointment when the children do survive her tests, as it means the cycle of mundane motherhood will continue uninterrupted. As the entry concludes, Verity turns her gaze toward the future. She realizes that the accidents are becoming more frequent and that Jeremy's suspicious or concerned glances are becoming harder to manage. She begins to plan her masterpiece, a way to ensure that she is the only person Jeremy truly needs for the rest of his life. For Lowen, reading this, the horror is no longer theoretical. She realizes that the woman she's living with didn't just dislike her children. She was actively, systematically pruning her family tree to make more room for herself. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, the tension that has been simmering between the real world and the manuscript world finally reaches a boiling point, resulting in a chapter defined by raw desire and absolute terror. Lowen is now living in a state of constant, vibrating anxiety. She is exhausted from the secrets she is carrying and the disturbing images of Verity's parenting that keep playing on a loop in her mind. The chapter begins with Lowen trying to ground herself in the physical reality of the house, but the house refuses to be normal. The boundary between Lowen and Verity starts to blur further. Lowen finds herself unconsciously mimicking Verity's habits or lingering in her spaces, driven by a need to understand the woman who could write such horrific things. Her attraction to Jeremy has evolved from a simple crush into a desperate, grounding force. He is the only thing in the house that feels alive and good, and Lowen begins to crave his presence as an antidote to the poison of the autobiography. The middle of the chapter features a significant shift in Lowen and Jeremy's relationship. After a particularly tense day of work and dodging the invisible pressures of the house, the two find themselves alone. The sexual chemistry that has been building since the crosswalk in Manhattan finally explodes. It is a moment of intense, almost frantic connection. For Lowen, it's a release of all the fear she's been holding. For Jeremy, It seems like a moment of escape from the grief and the clinical coldness of his life with a catatonic wife. However, even in the height of passion, the spectre of Verity hangs over them. Lowen is hyper-aware that the woman who owns this man is lying just floors away, and the guilt is a sharp edge against the pleasure. The climax of the chapter, however, is not the romance, but a moment of sheer psychological horror that Lowen cannot explain away. Late at night, Lowen is in the hallway, perhaps heading to the kitchen or returning to her room, when she looks toward the stairs. She sees Verity, not the broken Verity in the hospital bed, but a standing, mobile Verity at the top of the staircase, looking down at her. The description is haunting. Verity is a pale, silent ghost in the shadows, her eyes locked onto Lowen with a clarity that is unmistakably lucid. Lowen freezes, her heart hammering against her ribs. In this moment, all her theories about Verity faking her condition are confirmed in the most terrifying way possible. But as quickly as the figure appears, it is gone. When Lowen finally gains the courage to check Verity's room, she finds her exactly as she should be, tucked into her medical bed, hooked up to monitors, staring blankly at the ceiling. The gaslighting reaches its peak here. Lowen begins to doubt her own sanity. Was it a sleepwalking episode? A hallucination born of the manuscript? Or is Verity Crawford playing a game of cat and mouse that Lowen is destined to lose? The chapter ends with Lowen back in her room, the door locked and her breath hitching. She realizes that she is no longer safe. Whether Verity is a ghost or a faker, she is a presence that is actively haunting Lowen. The manuscript is no longer just a book she's reading. It's a warning she hasn't fully heeded. She picks up the pages once more, realizing that if she's going to survive this house, she needs to know exactly how Verity's masterpiece ends. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 8. In Chapter 8, the morning after the staircase encounter and her intimate moment with Jeremy, Lowen is afraid wire. She is caught in a debilitating cycle of, "Did I really see that?" versus, "I know what I saw." The chapter focuses on the psychological toll of being the only person in the house who doesn't believe in Verity's tragedy. Lowen feels like she is living in a parallel reality where the ghost she sees at night is the same woman Jeremy tenderly washes and cares for during the day. The chapter opens with Lowen attempting to reconcile the physical evidence of her own eyes with the medical reality presented to her. She watches Jeremy interact with Verity, and the scene is agonizingly intimate. Jeremy is patient and loving, talking to his unresponsive wife as if she can hear him. Lowen watches this and feels a toxic mix of jealousy, pity, and absolute horror. She wants to scream the truth at him, but she realizes that without proof, she will look like a jealous, mentally unstable intruder trying to ruin a grieving man's life. A significant portion of this chapter is dedicated to Lowen's growing bond with Crew. The little boy is the only other mobile presence in the house during the day, and his behavior starts to take on a more ominous tone in Lowen's mind. She watches him play and wonders how much a child his age understands about his mother's accident and his sister's deaths. There is a moment where Crew says something, a casual, childish remark about his mother, that sends a jolt through Lowen. It suggests that the child might be more aware of the house's secrets than Jeremy realizes. The tension with the nurse, April, also escalates in this chapter. April is the gatekeeper of Verity's medical care, and she views Lowen with a cold, professional suspicion. Lowen feels that April is another obstacle in her quest to prove Verity is faking. In a moment of desperation, Lowen tries to subtly probe April for any unusual behavior Verity might have shown, but April shuts her down, reaffirming that Verity is a vegetable. This further isolates Lowen, making her feel like the house itself is conspiring to keep Verity's secrets safe. The climax of Chapter 8 occurs when Lowen is alone in the house with Verity. Driven by a mix of fear and a need for vindication, Lowen decides to set a trap. This isn't just a sudden movement like before. It's a calculated attempt to force Verity's hand. The atmosphere in the room is described as suffocatingly quiet. Lowen does something, perhaps moves an object just out of reach, or creates a situation where a catatonic person would instinctively react, and waits. The silence that follows is deafening. Lowen describes the sensation of Verity's presence being so thick it feels like a physical weight. Yet the woman on the bed remains a statue. The chapter ends with Lowen retreating to the office, feeling more insane than ever. She realizes that if Verity is faking, she is a master of psychological warfare who is willing to suffer physical discomfort and indignity just to maintain the charade. Lowen begins to understand that she isn't just fighting for Jeremy's heart. She is in a life-or-death battle of wills with a woman who has already proven that she has no limits. She reaches for the next "so be it" entry, desperate for a weapon she can use against the living ghost downstairs. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 9. In Chapter 9, the tension in the Crawford house moves from psychological to physical. Lowen is now operating on very little sleep, and the lines between Verity's manuscript and her own reality have blurred to the point of no return. The chapter begins with Lowen feeling a sense of impending doom. The staircase ghost from the previous night has convinced her that the house is no longer safe, but she is so deeply enmeshed with Jeremy and the mystery that she cannot bring herself to leave. The morning is dominated by a harrowing incident involving Crew. While Jeremy is distracted, Crew manages to injure himself, a relatively minor cut, but in the context of this house, it feels catastrophic. Lowen watches Jeremy's reaction, which is a mix of hypervigilance and a strange, weary kind of grief. This incident triggers a "so be it" memory for Lowen. She recalls Verity's writing about how she used the twins' injuries to manipulate Jeremy. Watching Jeremy bleed for his son makes Lowen feel a visceral surge of hatred for the woman downstairs who turned tragedy into a hobby. Lowen's suspicion of Verity reaches a breaking point in this chapter. She decides that she can no longer wait for Verity to slip up. She has to force the issue. Lowen waits until the house is quiet and the nurse is occupied, then she creeps back into Verity's room. This time, Lowen isn't just watching, she is aggressive. She stands over Verity and speaks to her, her voice dripping with the knowledge of the manuscript. She tells Verity that she knows what she did to the girls. She describes the details of the manuscript, hoping the sheer shock of being found out will break Verity's catatonic mask. The atmosphere in the room during this confrontation is described as electric. Lowen is convinced she sees Verity's pulse quicken in her neck. She watches Verity's eyes, which are supposed to be fixed and vacant, and she is certain she sees a flicker of pure, concentrated malice. The terror of this scene comes from the silence. Verity doesn't speak. She doesn't move. But the intent coming off her body is so strong that Lowen has to flee the room, feeling as though she's just stared into the eyes of a shark. Later in the chapter, the physical connection between Lowen and Jeremy deepens, but it is marred by Lowen's mounting evidence. They share a moment of intense vulnerability, where Jeremy opens up about the loss of his daughters. He describes the day Chastin died, the official version, and Lowen has to physically restrain herself from screaming the manuscript version at him. This creates a painful wall between them. Lowen realizes she is now the keeper of the truth that could either save Jeremy or destroy him completely. The chapter ends with a chilling discovery. Lowen returns to her room and finds something shifted. Throughout the book, Lowen has been using a test of her own, placing small objects or marking things to see if they are moved. In the final moments of Chapter 9, she realizes that someone has been in her room while she was gone. The sense of being hunted is no longer a theory. Lowen realizes that if Verity is mobile, she knows Lowen has the manuscript. The predator knows the prey is watching, and the power dynamic in the house shifts from a mystery to a survival horror. So be it Chapter 4. Since the So Be It manuscript entries are scattered throughout the book, rather than being numbered traditionally like the regular chapters, the fourth entry is a pivotal and disturbing segment. It typically appears after Chapter 9 and focuses on the timeline where the twins are toddlers, and Verity's resentment has curdled into a dangerous, calculated game of discipline. In this fourth manuscript entry, Verity's narrative moves away from the birth of the children and focuses on her psychological warfare against the twins, Harper and Chastin. She writes about them not as daughters, but as rivals for Jeremy's attention. The prose is chilling because Verity describes her own lack of maternal instinct as a form of superior clarity. She admits that while Jeremy sees accidents and unfortunate luck, she sees opportunities to test the girls' boundaries. She details how she taught them to be terrified of her, without ever raising her voice or leaving a mark that Jeremy would notice. It was a regime of silent psychological intimidation, designed to make the girls cling to her in fear when Jeremy was around, making it look like they were attached to a loving mother. The most horrific part of this specific entry is Verity's description of the water test. Verity writes about her growing obsession with the lake behind their house. She describes the twins' natural curiosity about the water and how she began to fantasize about a world where they simply weren't there to occupy Jeremy's time. She recounts a day when she took the girls down to the dock, and the description is clinical and devoid of any human warmth. She writes about the possibility of an accident, weighing the pros and cons of how Jeremy would react to a tragedy versus how he would react to a lifetime of divided attention. She admits to watching them near the edge, her heart not racing with fear for their safety, but with the cold calculation of a woman waiting for a coin to flip. Verity also delves into the masterpiece she is creating in her marriage. She realizes that by being the one who suffers alongside Jeremy, she can bond with him in a way that happiness never allowed. She describes the beauty of a husband who is broken by grief because a broken man is a man who stays. He becomes dependent on her strength, her body, and her presence to survive the loss of his children. For Verity, the potential death of a child is transformed into a romantic investment. She views the twins as currency that she can spend to buy more of Jeremy's soul. The entry concludes with a terrifying reflection on Chastin and Harper's differing personalities. One twin is more compliant, while the other is more difficult and observant, meaning she sees Verity for what she truly is. Verity writes about this difficult daughter with a specific, sharpened malice. She realizes that as the girls get older, her mask will become harder to maintain. The entry ends with a sense of dark finality. Verity decides that she cannot let them grow up to tell Jeremy the truth. She needs to ensure that the narrative of the tragic accident is the only one that ever exists. For Lowen, reading this specific entry is the moment the floor drops out from under her. It provides the motive for everything that has happened in the house and confirms her worst fear: that Verity isn't just a bad person, but a calculated predator who viewed her own children as obstacles to be removed. Verity, by Colleen Hoover, Chapter 10. In Chapter 10, the atmosphere of the Crawford house shifts from unsettling to overtly dangerous. Lowen is now operating in a state of sleep-deprived hypervigilance, her mind poisoned by the water test she just read about in the manuscript. She can no longer look at the lake outside the windows without seeing it as a graveyard, and she can no longer look at Verity as a patient. To Lowen, Verity is a predator playing a long game, and the terrifying realization sets in that she, Lowen, is the only person standing between this woman and the people she has been systematic in destroying. The chapter focuses heavily on Lowen's internal struggle with the Jeremy problem. She is deeply in love with him, or at least, she is deeply attached to the version of him she wants to protect. But she is paralyzed by the truth she holds. She fears that if she shows him the manuscript, he will break. Worse, she fears he won't believe her, or that Verity has already anticipated this move and has a counterplay ready. The psychological isolation Lowen feels is at its peak here. She is trapped in a house with a man she can't fully trust, with the truth, and a child she is terrified to leave alone with his mother. A pivotal moment occurs when Lowen decides to take an active role in securing the house. She begins checking the locks on her door and the baby monitors with a frantic energy. During the day, she has a brief but loaded interaction with Crew. The boy's innocent presence is now a source of anxiety for Lowen. She looks at him and sees the last remaining obstacle in Verity's path to having Jeremy all to herself. She feels an overwhelming urge to grab the boy and flee, but she is anchored to the house by her desire for Jeremy and her need to finish the job she was hired for. The climax of Chapter 10 involves a physical manifestation of Lowen's paranoia. While Jeremy is out of the room, Lowen finds herself alone in the hallway near Verity's door. She experiences a moment of absolute certainty that the catatonic woman is not only awake, but active. She notices a small, almost imperceptible change in the environment, perhaps a scent that shouldn't be there, or a slight displacement of a piece of furniture. This leads to a heart-stopping sequence, where Lowen believes she hears footsteps that aren't her own. The house, with its large, echoing rooms and shadowed corners, feels like it's closing in on her. The chapter culminates in a scene of intense, shadowed confrontation. Lowen ends up back in Verity's room, and the air is thick with a silent, mutual acknowledgement of the war they are fighting. Lowen speaks to Verity again, but this time her voice isn't shaking. It's cold. She tells Verity that she is reading the manuscript and that she knows exactly what happened to the twins. She is essentially declaring war, betting that Verity's ego won't allow her to remain silent if she knows her secrets are being unraveled. The chapter ends with Lowen retreating to the office, her heart racing. She feels a strange mix of terror and triumph. She has stopped being the victim and has started being the antagonist in Verity's real-life story. However, as she closes the door and the lock clicks into place, she realizes the weight of what she's done. She has challenged a woman who killed her own children for the sake of an obsession. As she reaches for the manuscript to continue reading, Lowen knows that she has just accelerated the timeline of the masterpiece, and she might not like how the final chapter ends. Verity, by Colleen Hoover, Chapter 11. In Chapter 11, the atmospheric dread of the Crawford house reaches a fever pitch as Lowen Ashley's psychological state begins to unravel under the weight of the So Be It manuscript and the eerie reality of her surroundings. The chapter opens with Lowen feeling completely submerged in Verity's dark history. She is no longer just a ghostwriter. She has become a detective in a house of horrors, and the boundary between her own identity and the woman she is replacing starts to feel dangerously thin. The narrative focuses heavily on the escalating physical and emotional connection between Lowen and Jeremy. Driven by a mix of genuine attraction and a desperate need for a sense of safety, Lowen finds herself gravitating toward him more than ever. Their interactions are charged with an intense, forbidden energy. For Jeremy, Lowen represents a breath of life in a home that has felt like a tomb for years. For Lowen, Jeremy is the only anchor keeping her from drifting into the same madness that consumed Verity. However, this connection is poisoned by the fact that Lowen is still keeping the manuscript a secret. She feels a profound sense of guilt, knowing that every time she kisses him, she is hiding the truth about the woman who destroyed his family. A significant portion of the chapter is dedicated to a terrifying encounter with young Crew. While Jeremy is occupied, Lowen spends time with the boy, and his behavior begins to trigger her manuscript-induced paranoia. Crew says something about his mother, a casual, chillingly matter-of-fact comment that suggests he might be seeing a very different version of Verity than Jeremy is. This interaction highlights the tragedy of the situation. The child is living in the middle of a psychological war zone, and his innocence is being slowly eroded by the house's secrets. Lowen realizes that if Verity is indeed faking her condition, Crew is in more danger than anyone else. The climax of Chapter 11 occurs when Lowen experiences another inexplicable event that shatters her remaining sense of security. While she is alone in the house, she hears a sound from the nursery, the room that belonged to the twins. Driven by a mix of fear and a need for answers, she investigates. The room is a preserved shrine to the dead girls, and being inside it feels like stepping into a cold, hollow memory. While in the room, Lowen discovers something that shouldn't be possible, a sign that someone has been in the room recently, or perhaps a piece of evidence that suggests Verity's reach extends far beyond her hospital bed. The chapter ends with a moment of raw, visceral terror. Lowen returns to her room and finds a message or a subtle change in her environment that feels like a direct threat. The ghost is no longer just watching from the stairs. She is interfering with Lowen's life. Lowen is left trembling, realizing that her war with Verity has officially begun. She realizes she can no longer stay in the house without revealing the truth to Jeremy, but she is terrified that the truth will be the thing that finally breaks him. As she locks her door for the night, the silence of the Vermont woods feels like a suffocating weight, and Lowen begins to wonder if she will even survive long enough to finish the book. So be it. Chapter 5. This So Be It manuscript entry is arguably the most devastating and controversial section of the book. It moves past the theoretical resentment Verity felt for her children and dives headfirst into the specific, cold-blooded details of the first major tragedy, the death of Harper. The entry begins with Verity reflecting on the increasing difficulty of managing two toddlers while trying to maintain her perfect facade for Jeremy. She describes the girls' personalities with a sharpening edge of cruelty. Harper, in particular, had become the focus of Verity's ire. Verity describes the child as being too perceptive, too demanding, and, most importantly, too much like a mirror that reflected Verity's own darkness back at her. Verity writes about the child's presence as an obstacle to the sexual and emotional intimacy she craved with Jeremy. The core of this chapter is the detailed account of the day Harper died. The official story that Jeremy believes is that it was a tragic freak accident involving the lake and a momentary lapse in supervision. However, the manuscript reveals a version of events that is calculated and predatory. Verity describes taking the girls out to the dock, her mind already made up that the weight of her life needed to be lightened. She writes about the silence of the lake and the way the water looked that day, with a poetic, disturbing detachment. She admits that she didn't just fail to watch Harper. She describes the psychological manipulation she used to lure the child into a dangerous position. Verity recounts the moments before Harper went into the water not with panic, but with a sense of clinical curiosity. She watched her daughter struggle, noting the physical reality of the situation without a single flicker of maternal instinct. In her writing, she justifies this by claiming she was giving the child a choice to save herself, a twisted logic that cements her status as a true sociopath. The most chilling part of the entry is the aftermath. Verity details how she transitioned from the executioner to the grieving mother in a matter of seconds. She describes the physical performance of her grief, the screaming, the frantic but useless rescue attempt, and the way she collapsed into Jeremy's arms once he arrived. She writes about the success of this performance with pride. To Verity, Harper's death was a successful transaction. She traded a daughter she didn't love for a level of devotion and pity from Jeremy that she had never experienced before. She describes their grief-stricken sex that night as the most connected she had ever felt to him, proving that, to her, tragedy was merely an aphrodisiac. The entry concludes with Verity looking at the surviving twin, Chastin, and the newborn, Crew. She notes that the house is quieter now, and Jeremy is more hers than ever. However, she also notes that Chastin was there that day, that the other twin might have seen more than a toddler should understand. This sets the stage for the next tragedy, as Verity realizes that even one witness is one too many. For Lowen, reading this is a breaking point. The manuscript has shifted from a dark autobiography into a confession of murder. She realizes she is living in a house with a woman who didn't just allow her child to die, but who orchestrated it to tighten her grip on her husband. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter Shire. In Chapter 12, the psychological boundaries between Lowen and Verity continue to erode, and the tension within the Crawford house shifts from a cold war of nerves into a series of terrifying, undeniable physical confrontations. Lowen is now operating on the raw edge of a breakdown. The revelations in the manuscript about Harper's death have made the very walls of the house feel tainted. She feels like a trespasser in a graveyard, but more dangerously, she feels like she is being hunted by a woman who is supposed to be a vegetable. The morning begins with Lowen attempting to maintain a professional facade with Jeremy, but the physical attraction between them is becoming impossible to contain. Their relationship in this chapter is a complex mix of grief, lust, and mutual desperation. For Jeremy, Lowen is the first thing that has made him feel alive since his world shattered. For Lowen, Jeremy is the only thing that feels real in a house full of lies. However, the shadow of the manuscript looms over every touch. Lowen is constantly fighting the urge to tell him everything, yet she is paralyzed by the fear that he won't believe her, or that the truth will be the final blow that destroys his sanity. The centerpiece of this chapter is the laundry room incident, a scene that heightens Lowen's paranoia to a fever pitch. While doing her own laundry, Lowen makes a discovery that shatters her remaining doubts about Verity's condition. She finds a piece of clothing or a discarded item in the trash that clearly indicates Verity has been moving, eating, or tending to herself in secret. The evidence is mundane, yet horrifying. A physical sign of life from a woman who is supposed to be a statue. This discovery leads Lowen to realize that Verity isn't just present in her mind. She is active in the house when no one is looking. Later in the chapter, Lowen has a moment with Crew that underscores the danger the child is in. Crew mentions something, a game or a secret, that he shares with his mother. This sends a jolt of terror through Lowen. She realizes that if Verity is faking, she is using her own son as a pawn or a witness to her charade. The protective instinct Lowen feels for Crew becomes a driving force, but it is complicated by her own fear. She begins to see the house not as a home, but as a maze where Verity knows every shortcut and Lowen is trapped in the center. The climax of Chapter 12 occurs during a nighttime sequence that is pure Gothic horror. Lowen is in her room, the door locked, when she hears the distinct sound of someone, or something, outside her door. It isn't the nurse, and it isn't Jeremy. It is the sound of a rhythmic, intentional presence. In a moment of sheer bravery, or madness, Lowen looks through the keyhole, or opens the door just a crack. She is met with a sight that she cannot explain away as a hallucination. The ghost of Verity is no longer just at the top of the stairs. She is in the hallway, mobile and menacing. The chapter ends with Lowen back in her room, leaning against the door with her heart hammering against her ribs. She realizes that the time for investigating is over. Verity knows that Lowen knows the truth. The predator and the prey are now fully aware of one another, and the manuscript, which Lowen keeps hidden like a weapon, is the only thing that can end the game. She realizes she has to get Jeremy to read it, but she has to do it in a way that ensures their survival. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 13. In Chapter 13, the psychological walls of the Crawford house feel as though they are physically closing in on Lowen. The chapter is defined by a deep, hollow sense of isolation. Despite being in a house with a man she is falling for and a child she wants to protect, Lowen has never felt more alone. The laundry room incident from the previous chapter has transformed her from a writer into a survivor. She is now certain that Verity is not a victim of a tragic accident, but a master manipulator who is hiding in plain sight. The chapter begins with Lowen attempting to maintain a normal conversation with Jeremy, but her mind is screaming. She watches him go through the motions of caregiving, changing Verity's IV bags, adjusting her pillows, and it feels like watching a man tend to a dormant volcano. Lowen's internal monologue is frantic. She begins to question Jeremy's role in the narrative. She wonders if it's possible that he knows Verity is faking. Is his grief a performance as well? Or is he truly the ultimate victim of Verity's masterpiece? This doubt adds a new, bitter layer to her attraction to him. She wants to trust him, but the house has taught her that trust is a liability. The middle of the chapter focuses on Lowen's deteriorating physical state. She is barely eating, and her sleep is interrupted by vivid nightmares that feel indistinguishable from her waking hours. She describes the sensation of Verity's presence as a smell or a pressure in the air. In a moment of high tension, Lowen finds herself alone in the kitchen with Crew. The boy is playing with a knife or a sharp object, a scene that immediately triggers Lowen's memory of Verity's tests from the manuscript. She lunges to take it away from him, and the intensity of her reaction startles the boy. This moment highlights how the manuscript has fundamentally altered Lowen's perception of reality. She can no longer see a child playing without seeing a potential victim. The climax of Chapter 13 occurs when Lowen decides to take a massive risk. She can no longer carry the weight of the So Be It manuscript alone. She decides that she must leave the manuscript in a place where Jeremy will find it accidentally. She believes that if she hands it to him, he might reject it or view her as a jealous interloper. But if he finds it himself, among his wife's things, the truth might finally take root. She spends the latter half of the chapter scouting the house for the perfect location, feeling like a spy in her own home. However, her plan is interrupted by a terrifying realization. As she moves through the house, she notices that the traps she set, the small hairs taped to doors or the specific placement of objects, have been disturbed in a way that suggests multiple rooms were accessed while she was in the office. This leads to the horrifying conclusion that Verity isn't just active. She is searching for the manuscript herself. The predator is looking for the evidence of her crimes. The chapter ends with Lowen back in her room, the manuscript clutched to her chest. She realizes that the house is a chessboard, and she has just made a move that could end in checkmate. She looks at the door handle, waiting for it to turn, realizing that she and Verity are now in a race to see who can reach Jeremy first, the woman with the truth, or the woman who has built a life out of lies. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 14. In Chapter 14, the psychological pressure reaches a breaking point, and the real world of the Crawford house becomes just as terrifying as the words in Verity's manuscript. Lowen is now operating on pure adrenaline and fear. She has reached a state where she no longer trusts her own eyes, yet she is more certain than ever that she is in mortal danger. The chapter opens with Lowen and Jeremy's relationship taking a turn toward the desperate. The honeymoon phase of their secret attraction is over, replaced by a heavy, somber intensity. They find themselves in a moment of physical intimacy that feels like an attempt to drown out the darkness of the house. For Lowen, sex with Jeremy has become a way to prove she is alive, a stark contrast to the living corpse of Verity downstairs. However, even in their most private moments, Lowen feels watched. She is haunted by the idea that Verity is not just faking her condition, but that she is actively enjoying the spectacle of Lowen replacing her, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim her territory. A major development in this chapter is Lowen's interaction with the nurse, April. Lowen begins to suspect that April might be more than just a hired hand. She wonders if April is complicit in Verity's charade. Lowen tries to probe April for information, asking about Verity's progress, but the nurse remains a wall of professional coldness. This leaves Lowen in a state of total isolation. She realizes that if something happens to her in this house, there is no one she can turn to for help. She is a woman without a witness. The centerpiece of Chapter 14 is a sequence involving Crew. Lowen observes a moment between Jeremy and his son that highlights the deep, irreparable trauma the family has suffered. Jeremy is a man trying to be a whole parent to a son who has lost his sisters, but Lowen sees the cracks in the foundation. She watches Crew play and is struck by a terrifying thought. Does Crew know his mother is awake? Does he talk to her when the adults aren't looking? This suspicion adds a layer of dread to every interaction with the child. The climax of the chapter occurs when Lowen experiences a physical glitch in the house's reality. She finds a piece of evidence, perhaps a door left ajar or a light turned on, that she knows she closed or turned off. She decides to confront the fear head-on. She goes to Verity's room while Jeremy is out, and this time, she doesn't just talk, she touches. She performs a physical test on Verity's body, looking for the telltale signs of a person who is exerting conscious control over their muscles. The tension in this scene is agonizing. Lowen is centimeters away from Verity's face, looking for a pupil to dilate or a muscle to twitch. The chapter ends with a chilling realization. As Lowen leaves the room, she catches a glimpse of herself in a mirror and realizes she is starting to look like the woman she is replacing, hollow-eyed, obsessive, and haunted. She realizes that Verity doesn't have to kill her to win, she just has to drive her insane. Lowen retreats to the office, knowing she has to finish the manuscript immediately. She needs to know how it ends, because she is beginning to fear that the ending of the book and the ending of her life are now one and the same. So be it. Chapter 6. This, so be it. Manuscript entry is the dark heart of the book. It chronicles the death of the second twin, Chastine, and it is here that Verity's narrative moves from disturbed to pure evil. The entry begins months after Harper's funeral. Verity describes the house as being filled with a delicious kind of grief. She notes that Jeremy is more attentive than ever, but she is starting to feel the burden of the remaining daughter, Chastine. While Harper was the mirror, Verity describes Chastain as the witness. She is convinced that the young girl knows what happened at the lake, even if she can't articulate it. Verity writes about the way Chastain looks at her, with a quiet, wide-eyed fear, and she decides that this look is an insult to the perfect mother role she is playing. The account of Chastain's death is a masterpiece of psychological horror. The official story, Jeremy believes, is that Chastain had an allergic reaction to a peanut while at a sleepover or a party. A tragic, unavoidable mistake. But the manuscript reveals a much more sinister reality. Verity describes a moment in the kitchen where she is alone with Chastain. She writes about the curiosity of watching her daughter eat, knowing exactly what was in the food. Verity details the physical onset of the allergic reaction with a clinical, detached prose that makes the reader's skin crawl. She describes the child's struggle for breath as a performance and admits that she stood in the kitchen, watching the clock, calculating exactly how long she needed to wait before calling for help to ensure it was too late. She wanted the death to look like a desperate, failed attempt at rescue. She even describes the practice she did in the mirror, working on her panicked expression and her grief-stricken voice, before finally making the call to Jeremy and 911. The most disturbing part of this entry is Verity's justification. She claims that by removing Chastain, she was actually saving Jeremy from the pain of raising a child who would always remind him of the daughter he lost. She frames the murder as an act of mercy for her husband, ensuring that his heart only has room for her and their upcoming replacement child, Crew. She describes the night after Chastain's death as a triumph, noting that Jeremy clung to her in the dark, weeping into her skin, and she felt a surge of power knowing she was the only thing he had left. The entry concludes with Verity looking toward the future. She is pregnant with Crew, and she writes about him with a terrifying sense of ownership. She has successfully pruned the family down to what she wants. For Lowen, reading this is like a physical blow. She realizes that Chastain didn't die from an accident or a mistake. She was executed by her own mother to satisfy a narcissistic obsession. As Lowen closes the manuscript, she looks toward the door of her room, realizing that the faker downstairs didn't just kill once, she killed twice, and she did it with a smile on her face. Lowen is no longer just afraid for herself. She is terrified for Crew, the only child Verity has left to test. Verity, by Colleen Hoover, Chapter 15. In Chapter 15, the psychological tension finally breaks, and the story transitions into a high-stakes thriller. Lowen is no longer content with just reading. She is convinced that she is in a kill or be killed scenario with Verity. After reading the confession about Chastain's death, Lowen's moral compass has shifted. She feels that protecting Jeremy and Crew justifies almost any action. The chapter begins with Lowen in a state of hyper-arousal. She has become a ghost in the Crawford house, moving silently and watching everything. Her focus is now entirely on the trap. She is tired of the subtle signs. She wants undeniable proof that Verity is mobile. Lowen decides to use the one thing she knows Verity cannot resist: Jeremy. Lowen orchestrates a situation where she and Jeremy are in a highly emotional, physically intimate position, in a part of the house where they are visible, or at least audible, to Verity. Lowen's intent is to provoke Verity's jealousy. She believes that if Verity is truly faking, she won't be able to stay still while another woman claims her husband in his own home. The atmosphere during this sequence is incredibly heavy. Lowen feels like she is using her own body as bait, and the guilt she feels toward Jeremy is nearly eclipsed by her terror of the woman downstairs. The climax of the chapter is one of the most famous scenes in the book. Lowen is upstairs, looking down the staircase through the banisters. She has set up a series of markers, small items that would be displaced if someone walked by. In the dim light of the hallway, she sees the impossible. Verity is standing at the top of the stairs. This isn't a shadow or a trick of the light. Verity is upright. Her eyes are wide and full of life, and she is looking directly at Lowen. There is a moment of pure, frozen silence where the two women lock eyes. In this gaze, there is no catatonic patient. There is only a predator who has been caught. Lowen is paralyzed by the sight, but before she can scream or call for Jeremy, Verity does something even more chilling. She simply turns and retreats back into her room with a fluidity that no paralyzed person could possess. Lowen's reaction is visceral. She doesn't just feel afraid, she feels vindicated and horrified all at once. She runs to Jeremy, but her words come out in a panicked, incoherent jumble. She tries to explain that she saw Verity standing, that she saw her walking, but Jeremy, ever the protective, grieving husband, looks at her with a mix of pity and concern. He thinks Lowen is having a breakdown from the stress of the Villains series and the gloom of the house. The chapter ends with Lowen realizing that she has reached the end of her rope. She has the proof she needs, but she has no way to make Jeremy believe it without showing him the manuscript. She returns to her room and retrieves the So Be It pages, knowing that the final entry, the one she hasn't finished yet, is the only thing that will destroy the wall of denial Jeremy has built. She realizes that tonight, the secrets of the Crawford family will either be buried forever or will burn the whole house down. So be it. Chapter 7. This is the final, climactic entry of the So Be It manuscript. If the previous chapters were a confession of murder, this one is a confession of survival through manipulation. It bridges the gap between the past, Verity, and the present, woman, lying in the bed downstairs. In this entry, Verity describes the final days leading up to her car accident. She acknowledges that the air in the house had become toxic. Jeremy was no longer the doting, oblivious husband. He was becoming suspicious, distant, and cold. Verity realizes that her masterpiece, the perfect, isolated life with Jeremy, is crumbling because he has begun to see through the accidents. She describes the pressure of maintaining her mask as becoming unbearable. The core of this entry is Verity's account of the car crash. The public story is that she lost control of the vehicle and hit a tree, resulting in her traumatic brain injury. But in the manuscript, Verity reveals that the crash was intentional. However, it wasn't a suicide attempt. It was a reset button. Verity describes the moment she decided to drive into that tree with terrifying lucidity. She realized that if she died or was broken, Jeremy's natural instinct to protect and grieve would override his growing suspicion. She calculated that a catastrophic injury would force him to stop investigating the past and start caring for her again. She writes about the impact not as a tragedy, but as a necessary sacrifice to regain control over her husband. The most shocking revelation comes at the end of the entry. Verity admits that she regained consciousness and much of her physical function much sooner than the doctors or Jeremy realized. She describes the moment she decided to stay broken. She realized that as a catatonic patient, she is untouchable. She can watch Jeremy, she can listen to his secrets, and she can ensure that no other woman ever takes her place. She writes about the freedom of being a vegetable, how she can move through the house at night like a ghost, eating and stretching her muscles, only to return to her statue state before the sun rises. The entry ends with a direct, chilling message. Verity reflects on the fact that if someone is reading this, it means she has failed to protect her secret. But then she pivots, essentially mocking the reader. She claims that even if Jeremy were to find these pages, he would never believe them over the evidence of her broken body. She believes she has won because she has turned herself into a permanent victim. For Lowen, reading these final words is the ultimate checkmate. She isn't just reading a memoir, she is reading a blueprint of the trap she is currently sitting in. She realizes that Verity isn't just faking for Jeremy. She is faking for the world, and she is willing to live a half-life of silence and immobility just to maintain her power. Lowen looks at the last page and realizes the terrifying truth. Verity knows she's been reading. Verity, by Colleen Hoover, Chapter 16. In Chapter 16, the slow burn psychological horror of the previous weeks finally detonates. This is the climax of the present-day narrative, where Lowen decides that she can no longer live in a house with a woman who murdered her own children and is currently pretending to be a vegetable. The chapter begins with Lowen in a state of absolute, icy resolve. She has finished the So Be It manuscript, and the final confession that Verity crashed her car on purpose to manipulate Jeremy is the final straw. Lowen realizes that every moment she stays silent, she is potentially complicit in whatever Verity plans to do next. She retrieves the manuscript and goes to find Jeremy, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she can feel it in her throat. When she finds Jeremy, the confrontation is raw and painful. Lowen doesn't ease into it. She tells him flat out that Verity is faking and that she has proof. At first, Jeremy reacts with the expected denial. He is angry, offended, and views Lowen's claims as a betrayal of his trust and an insult to his tragic reality. However, Lowen forces the manuscript into his hands. She makes him read the specific sections about the tests he didn't know about and the truth behind the twins' deaths. As Jeremy reads, the atmosphere in the room shifts from tension to a devastating, hollow silence. Lowen watches the man she loves crumble. She watches him realize that the woman he has been bathing, feeding, and mourning for months is a monster who viewed him as a prize and their children as disposable obstacles. The realization isn't just emotional, it's physical. Jeremy's grief turns into a cold, terrifying rage, a side of him Lowen has never seen before. The climax of the chapter occurs when Jeremy, fueled by a mixture of betrayal and fury, heads to Verity's room. Lowen follows, terrified of what is about to happen. In the room, the charade finally ends. Whether it's the look in Jeremy's eyes or the weight of the manuscript in his hand, Verity's mask slips. In a moment of pure survival instinct, Verity reacts. She isn't the limp, vacant patient anymore. She is a woman who realizes she has been caught. The confrontation becomes physical and violent. Jeremy, pushed past his breaking point, confronts the woman who killed his daughters. The scene is chaotic and visceral. Jeremy's internal protector instinct has been twisted into something vengeful. Lowen stands by, a witness to a domestic tragedy that has been years in the making. The chapter culminates in a desperate struggle where the truth is no longer a secret, and the living ghost of Verity Crawford is finally held accountable in the most brutal way possible. The chapter ends with a sense of grim finality. The masterpiece that Verity spent her life writing has been torn apart, and the wreckage of the Crawford family is laid bare. Lowen is left standing in the ruins of the house, realizing that while she may have saved Jeremy and crew, the cost of the truth was higher than she ever imagined. Verity, by Colleen Hoover, Chapter 17. Chapter 17 is the visceral, haunting conclusion to the main timeline of the novel. It is the moment where the psychological horror of the previous 16 chapters transforms into a grim, physical reality. The chapter begins in the immediate, suffocating aftermath of the confrontation in Verity's bedroom. The mask has stayed off, but the result is a scene of absolute chaos. Jeremy is a man transformed. The gentle, grieving husband has been replaced by someone hollowed out by a betrayal so deep it has erased his capacity for mercy. Lowen watches, paralyzed, as the man she thought she knew takes control of the situation with a terrifying clinical efficiency. The focus of the chapter is the final elimination of Verity's charade. Jeremy decides that if Verity wants to be a vegetable, he will make it a reality. In a sequence that is difficult to read, he forces a confrontation that tests Verity's physical reflexes one last time. When she finally reacts, confirming beyond any doubt that she has been conscious and mobile this entire time, the rage Jeremy has suppressed since the deaths of his daughters boils over. Lowen becomes an accomplice in this chapter. She is no longer just an observer. She is the one who provided the catalyst, the manuscript. And she stays to help Jeremy manage the fallout. There is a chilling moment where they realize that they cannot call the police. If they show the manuscript, it reveals Verity's crimes, but it also reveals their own motives. Jeremy decides that he cannot let Verity go to prison, only to eventually be released. He needs a permanent solution to protect Crew. The climax of the chapter involves the staged death of Verity Crawford. Working together in a daze of adrenaline and shared trauma, Jeremy and Lowen make it look as though Verity finally succumbed to her injuries, a natural end to her long, tragic decline. The silence that follows the act is heavier than any silence Lowen has experienced in the house before. It is the silence of a shared secret that will bind her and Jeremy together for the rest of their lives. The chapter ends with a haunting sense of normalcy. They clean the room, they check on Crew, who is mercifully asleep, and they prepare to face the world as a grieving widower and a helpful colleague. As they stand together in the dark, Lowen realizes that she has finally gotten what she wanted. Verity is gone, and Jeremy is hers. But as she looks at him, she wonders if she has truly saved him, or if she has simply helped him become a different kind of monster. So be it. Chapter 8. This manuscript entry takes place in the dark period following the deaths of both Harper and Chastain. Verity writes with a chilling sense of relief that the clutter of her life is gone. She describes the house as a temple dedicated to her and Jeremy, but she notes a disturbing change in him. He is no longer just a husband. He has become a shell of a man, consumed by a protective, almost manic devotion to their infant son, Crew. Verity expresses a deep, simmering jealousy toward her own baby. She observes Jeremy holding Crew and feels a physical ache of resentment that his arms aren't around her instead. She writes about the biological error of motherhood, claiming that she was never meant to share Jeremy's heart with anyone. The most horrifying part of this entry is her admission that she has begun to view Crew as a rival. She describes watching the baby sleep and thinking about how fragile his life is, just like his sisters were. However, she realizes that Jeremy is now hyper-aware of tragedy. She knows she can't stage another accident without losing him forever. This realization leads her to a new, twisted conclusion. She doesn't need to get rid of the baby. She needs to make herself the most important tragedy in Jeremy's life. This is the moment she begins to formulate the idea of her own catastrophic accident. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 18. The heavy, metallic silence in the room after Verity's death is almost louder than the violence that preceded it. Lowen stands frozen, watching Jeremy as the adrenaline begins to drain from his face, leaving behind a cold, hollow mask. The man who was just a grieving husband minutes ago is now a man who has committed a calculated act of vengeance, and Lowen realizes with a jolt of terror that she is his only witness and his only accomplice. There is no going back to the way things were before she handed him those pages. They are now bound together by a secret that is far heavier than the manuscript itself. Jeremy moves through the room with an eerie, mechanical focus. He begins to reset the scene, smoothing out the rumpled sheets and adjusting Verity's limp body back into the pose of a vacant patient. He doesn't look at Lowen as he speaks, his voice dropping into a low, commanding tone. He tells her exactly what the narrative is going to be. Verity simply stopped breathing. It was the tragic, inevitable end to a long decline. He is essentially ghostwriting their reality in real time, and Lowen finds herself nodding, her own voice stolen by the sheer gravity of what they've done. She realizes that the villains series she was hired to finish has bled out of the computer screen and into the very air she is breathing. As they wait for the nurse, April, to return, Lowen feels a sickening shift in her perception of Jeremy. The protective, heroic image she had of him is fractured. She watches him check the IV lines and the monitor, ensuring everything looks normal, and she wonders how much of his previous grief was a performance as well. If he can cover up a death this efficiently, what else is he capable of? The house, which already felt haunted by the twins, now feels like it is physically shrinking around her. Every creak of the floorboards sounds like a footstep, and every shadow looks like Verity standing up one last time to point a finger at them. The chapter reaches a peak of tension when they hear the sound of the front door opening and the familiar, brisk footsteps of the nurse in the hallway. This is the moment where their masterpiece is tested. Lowen's heart hammers against her ribs as April enters the room, and the air seems to vanish. The transition from the private horror of their crime to the public performance of a tragedy is instantaneous. Jeremy's face crumples into a look of devastated shock, a transition so seamless that it makes Lowen's skin crawl. She is forced to play along, standing in the corner as the concerned houseguest, watching as the professional gears of the medical and legal world begin to turn. By the end of the chapter, the house is no longer a home or a workplace. It is a stage. Lowen retreats to her room, her hands shaking so violently she can barely lock the door. She realizes that while she might have been the one to find the truth in the manuscript, she is now trapped by it. She is no longer just a writer documenting Verity's life. She has become a character in Verity's final, darkest chapter. As she hears the distant sirens of the authorities approaching, she realizes that the only thing more dangerous than Verity's secrets is the way Jeremy has decided to bury them. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 19. The arrival of the police and the coroner transforms the Crawford house into a sterile, professional environment that feels jarringly at odds with the violence that just occurred. Lowen spends most of the chapter in a state of dissociative shock, watching from the sidelines as the authorities move through the hallways. She is hyper-aware of the manuscript tucked away in her room, feeling its presence like a ticking bomb. Every time an officer glances her way, she is certain they can see the guilt written on her face. But to her surprise, she is treated with the gentle deference reserved for a bystander to a tragedy. Jeremy's performance throughout the investigation is nothing short of chilling. Lowen watches him interact with the officers, his voice thick with the perfect amount of weary grief. He answers their questions with a heartbreaking sincerity that makes Lowen wonder if he has managed to convince himself that the murder was actually a natural passing. He provides the timeline of Verity's decline with such precision that the police never even think to question the cause of death. Seeing him lie so effortlessly to authority figures makes Lowen realize that she doesn't truly know the man she has risked everything for. She begins to see that while Verity was the monster in the manuscript, Jeremy has a darkness of his own that is perhaps more dangerous because it is so well hidden. A secondary layer of tension arises during a brief, loaded encounter with the nurse, April. While the police are occupied, April looks at Lowen with an expression that isn't quite sympathy. There is a sharp, knowing quality to the nurse's gaze that suggests she noticed the subtle shifts in the room, perhaps a misplaced item or a lingering tension, before the authorities arrived. She makes a comment about how quiet the house feels now, and the way she lingers on the word makes Lowen's blood run cold. Lowen realizes that even if the police are satisfied, they aren't necessarily safe. There are too many people who have been in and out of this house, and secrets have a way of leaking through the floorboards. The chapter ends with Lowen retreating to the office to pack the last of her things. She can no longer stand the sight of the desk where she read the manuscript or the bed where she slept, while Verity watched her from the shadows. She feels a desperate, clawing need to escape the Crawford estate, yet she finds herself anchored by her connection to Jeremy and crew. As she looks out the window at the dark woods, she realizes that she is no longer the woman who arrived in Vermont a few weeks ago. She is now a co-conspirator in a death that will never be investigated, and she begins to fear that the price of her freedom will be a lifetime of looking over her shoulder. So Be It, Chapter 9. This So Be It entry is a harrowing dive into the final days before Verity's car accident, and it serves as the ultimate bridge between her past crimes and her present-day charade. In this section, Verity's narrative tone shifts from cold detachment to a frantic survivalist intensity. She writes about the walls closing in, not because of guilt, but because she realizes that Jeremy's love for her has fundamentally changed. He is no longer looking at her with the blind adoration she requires. He is looking at her with a growing, silent suspicion that she cannot manipulate away. The core of this entry focuses on the aftermath of Chastine's death and the birth of Crew. Verity describes the house as a tomb where Jeremy has buried his heart. She writes with immense bitterness about how Jeremy spends every waking moment with the baby, as if he is trying to protect Crew from an invisible predator. Verity realizes that she has lost her status as the center of the universe. To her, the existence of another person, even her own child, who receives Jeremy's primary devotion, is an insult that she cannot tolerate. She admits that she spent hours watching them, feeling like an outsider in the family she built, and she began to realize that the only way to regain her power was to become a victim so profound that Jeremy would have no choice but to return to her side. The most disturbing part of this chapter is Verity's detailed planning of the masterpiece. She doesn't just describe a desire to be injured. She describes the clinical calculation of how much damage she would need to sustain to be saved, but not killed. She writes about the car accident as a calculated business move. She knew that if she were simply to get better or be normal, Jeremy would eventually leave her or find the truth about the girls. But if she were broken, if she were a silent, tragic figure, he would be trapped by his own morality and his own need to be a protector. She writes about the steering wheel and the tree with a poetic, terrifying lack of fear, viewing the impending crash as a baptism that would wash away his suspicions and reset their marriage. The entry concludes with a chilling reflection on the nature of truth. Verity writes that a person can get away with anything as long as they are willing to suffer enough for the lie. She notes that Jeremy is a man who loves broken things, and so she decided to become the most broken thing he had ever seen. As Lowen reads these words in the context of the present day, knowing that Verity is now dead by Jeremy's hand, the irony is suffocating. Verity thought she was the one in control of the narrative, but she didn't account for the fact that a man who loves broken things might eventually decide to break them further once he realizes he's been fooled. Verity, by Colleen Hoover, Chapter 20. In Chapter 20, the physical presence of the police and the coroner has finally cleared out, leaving the Crawford house in a state of unnatural, hollow silence. The body is gone, but the atmosphere is heavier than ever. Lowen and Jeremy are left alone in the wreckage of their shared reality, and for the first time, there is no patient to care for and no villain to hide from. However, instead of feeling like a relief, the absence of Verity feels like a vacuum that is sucking the air out of the room. Lowen finds herself wandering the house, feeling like a ghost in a place that no longer has a purpose. She goes to the kitchen where Jeremy is, and the interaction between them is strained and fragile. The intense sexual and emotional heat that fueled their relationship throughout the book has been replaced by a cold, survivalist bond. They aren't just lovers anymore. They are fellow soldiers who have survived a war by committing a war crime. Jeremy is still operating with a robotic efficiency, cleaning up the last remnants of the medical supplies. But Lowen notices the subtle tremors in his hands. The weight of what he did, using the manuscript as a justification to end his wife's life, is beginning to settle into his bones. They eventually move to the bedroom, but the intimacy between them has shifted. As they lie together in the dark, Lowen is haunted by the thought that their entire relationship is built on a foundation of secrets and blood. She wonders if Jeremy can ever truly look at her without seeing the woman who handed him the evidence that turned him into a killer. There is a deep, unspoken fear in Lowen that she hasn't just saved Jeremy from Verity. She has changed him into someone she doesn't fully recognize. The heroic Jeremy who protected his son is now a man who knows how to hide a body in plain sight. The chapter emphasizes the psychological toll of the masterpiece. Lowen realizes that even though Verity is dead, she hasn't truly left the house. The manuscript is still there, tucked away, and the memories of the twins are embedded in the walls. Lowen feels a desperate urge to leave Vermont, to take Jeremy and crew and run as far away as possible. But she realizes that the Crawford family history isn't something you can drive away from. They are carrying the manuscript's darkness inside them now. The chapter ends with a sense of grim transition. They agree that they need to move on, to start over, and to raise crew in a place that doesn't smell like sickness and secrets. But as Lowen closes her eyes, she realizes that the happily ever after she envisioned is tainted. She is now the keeper of the Crawford secrets, and she knows that for the rest of her life, she will be looking at Jeremy and wondering if the truth will ever come back to haunt them both. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 21. In Chapter 21, the narrative jumps forward 7 months. The oppressive, wintry gloom of the Crawford estate in Vermont has been replaced by the warmth and brightness of a house by the ocean. Lowen, Jeremy, and crew have relocated, attempting to scrub the Verity out of their lives and start over as a functional family unit. On the surface, it looks like they've achieved the impossible. They are happy. Lowen is now heavily pregnant with Jeremy's child. This physical manifestation of their new life acts as a shield against the past, yet the chapter is thick with a sense of underlying fragility. While they have successfully integrated into a new community where nobody knows their history, Lowen is still hypervigilant. She describes her life as a fragile glass structure that could shatter at any moment. Every time Jeremy is too perfect or too kind, she is reminded of the cold, lethal man she saw in that bedroom in Vermont. The ghost of how their relationship was cemented through a shared act of violence is the third guest at every dinner table. The relationship with crew is a central focus here. Jeremy is an incredibly attentive father, almost overcompensating for the trauma the boy went through. Lowen watches them together and feels a mix of intense love and a lingering, hollow dread. She often looks at Crew and wonders how much he remembers, or if the accidents his mother caused left scars on his psyche that haven't surfaced yet. There is a sense that they are all performing normalcy for each other, afraid that if they stop moving, the reality of what they did to Verity will catch up to them. The chapter highlights the professional side of Lowen's life as well. The Villains series, the reason she was brought into the Crawford's orbit in the first place, is a massive success. She has finished the books, and the public is eating them up, irony intended. However, the irony isn't lost on Lowen. She is being celebrated for writing fictional villains, while the real-life villain's death remains her deepest secret. She feels like a fraud, not just as a writer, but as a human being. The chapter ends on a note of uneasy peace. They are preparing for the birth of the baby, and for a moment, it seems like the darkness of the manuscript is finally buried. But as Lowen looks at the ocean, she realizes that secrets, much like the tide, have a way of washing back up. The happily ever after is in full swing, but the reader can feel the floorboards starting to creak again. So be it. Chapter 10. This final "so be it" entry is the most disturbing piece of writing in the entire manuscript because it covers the absolute end of the line, the days immediately preceding the car crash that changed everything. In this entry, Verity writes with a terrifying level of detachment about the biological failure of her family. She acknowledges that the deaths of the twins didn't produce the result she wanted. Instead of Jeremy turning back to her with undivided devotion, he became a man obsessed with safety, rules, and the survival of Crew. Verity describes herself as a spectator in her own home, watching Jeremy and Crew share a bond that she feels completely excluded from. She writes about the bitterness of being the mother of ghosts, while Jeremy is the father of a survivor. The core of this chapter is the cold-blooded calculation of her accident. She details how she studied the road, the speed required, and the specific angle of the tree. She wasn't looking for a way to die. She was looking for a way to rebrand herself. She writes that as long as she is a healthy, functioning woman, Jeremy will eventually find a reason to leave her or hold her accountable for the darkness in their house. But if she is a victim, a tragic, broken figure, he is morally obligated to stay. She describes the upcoming crash as her masterpiece, a way to force Jeremy to spend the rest of his life serving her. The entry ends with a chilling observation about her son, Crew. She mentions that she can see the fear in Crew's eyes when he looks at her, and she realizes that the boy is a witness she can no longer control through words. By becoming a vegetable, she realizes she can effectively silence him. No one believes a child who claims his catatonic mother is talking to him or moving at night. She signs off this entry with the phrase, "So be it," essentially accepting that her life as a person is over, but her life as a legend in Jeremy's heart is just beginning. This is the last thing Lowen reads from the manuscript, and it solidifies her belief that Verity was a predator who would sacrifice her own body just to keep her husband in a cage of guilt. Verity, by Colleen Hoover, Chapter 22. In Chapter 22, the new life Lowen and Jeremy have built begins to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a different kind of prison. The jump in time hasn't healed the underlying trauma. It has only buried it under a layer of expensive seaside decor and the physical weight of Lowen's pregnancy. Lowen is now at the stage where every movement of the baby reminds her of the life she is bringing into a world built on a foundation of corpses and lies. The chapter focuses heavily on the psychological distance that has grown between Lowen and Jeremy. While they are physically close, the intimacy is performative. Lowen finds herself watching Jeremy while he sleeps, wondering if he ever dreams about the night in Vermont. She realizes that they never talk about Verity. Her name is a forbidden word in their house, yet her presence is everywhere. Lowen notes that Jeremy has become almost too perfect as a partner, which triggers her paranoia. She knows now what he is capable of when he feels the need to protect his family. A significant part of this chapter involves Crew. The boy is older now, but he remains quiet and observant. Lowen catches him staring at her, or at the empty spaces in the room, with an expression that reminds her of the way he used to look at the stairs in the old house. She begins to wonder if children can sense the blood on their parents' hands. This fear is exacerbated when Jeremy mentions that they need to go back to the Vermont house one last time to finalize the sale and clear out the remaining storage. The thought of returning to that house sends Lowen into a spiral of anxiety. The house represents the truth that they've been running from. She realizes that as long as that house stands, and as long as their belongings are still inside it, they aren't truly free. Jeremy tries to reassure her, but his calmness is what unsettles her the most. He treats the return to the site of his wife's murder as a mere logistical chore. The chapter ends with the decision to return. Lowen knows that she cannot stay behind. She needs to be there to ensure that every scrap of the past is burned or buried. She packs her bags with a sense of impending doom, feeling that the house in Vermont is a predator that has been waiting patiently for them to return so it can finally finish what it started. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 23. In Chapter 23, the return to the Crawford estate in Vermont feels like stepping back into a nightmare. The house is colder and more desolate than before, smelling of dust and the lingering clinical scent of a hospital room. While Jeremy is focused on the logistics of clearing out the final heavy furniture and signing the closing papers, Lowen is a nervous wreck. She feels as though the walls are closing in on her, and every floorboard creak sounds like Verity's phantom footsteps. Lowen's primary mission is to ensure that no trace of the So Be It manuscript remains. Even though she believes they destroyed the pages she found, she is plagued by the fear that Verity might have hidden other copies or evidence of her writing exercises. She finds herself drawn back to Verity's bedroom, the site of the final confrontation. The room has been stripped of the medical equipment, but the indentation of the bed remains on the carpet, a permanent scar of the woman who spent months faking her own catatonia there. While Jeremy is downstairs helping the movers, Lowen begins a frantic final sweep of the room. Her paranoia leads her to check the places only a writer or a hider would think of. She begins to inspect the floorboards and the cracks in the architecture. It is during this search that she notices a slight imperfection in the flooring near the back of the walk-in closet. The climax of the chapter occurs when Lowen pries up a loose floorboard. She expects to find more pages of the autobiography, more evidence of Verity's madness to justify what they did. Instead, she finds a letter. This isn't part of the manuscript. It's a letter addressed to Jeremy, written in a hand that is frantic but clear. The chapter ends on a cliffhanger of absolute dread. As Lowen hears Jeremy calling her name from downstairs, his voice warm and unsuspecting, she opens the letter and reads the first few lines. Her entire world tilts. The letter isn't a confession of crimes, it's a desperate plea, and it suggests that everything Lowen thought she knew about the twins, the accidents, and the manuscript itself was a lie. Lowen stands in the closet, clutching the paper, realizing that if this letter is true, she and Jeremy didn't execute a monster. They murdered a victim. Verity, by Colleen Hoover, Chapter 24. In Chapter 24, the floor literally and figuratively drops out from under Lowen. Standing in the dim light of the closet, she reads the letter Verity wrote to Jeremy, a letter that was never meant for Lowen's eyes, and one that refutes every horrifying claim made in the So Be It manuscript. The letter reveals a completely different reality. Verity claims that the manuscript was never a confession. She explains that her literary agent had suggested she try a writing exercise called antagonistic journaling. The goal was to write from the perspective of a persona that was the exact opposite of herself, to breathe life into her darkest fears and turn herself into a villain as a way to cope with the unbearable grief of losing her daughters. Verity writes to Jeremy, pleading with him to believe that she loved their girls more than life itself, and that the accidents were just that. Horrific, tragic accidents that she blamed herself for so deeply she had to write them as murders just to process the pain. As Lowen reads, she feels a sickening sense of vertigo. Verity explains in the letter that she began faking her injuries because she was terrified of Jeremy. She claims that after Jeremy found the manuscript, he didn't confront her with words. He tried to kill her by causing the car accident. She writes that she realized the only way to stay alive and stay near her son, Crew, was to pretend she was brain dead. She stayed in that bed, paralyzed by choice, because she believed that if she ever woke up, Jeremy would finish what he started. She describes the agony of watching another woman, Lowen, enter her home and move into her life, all while she was trapped in a self-imposed prison of silence to avoid being murdered by her husband. Lowen's mind is racing, trying to find the holes in this new narrative. She looks for signs of manipulation, but the letter is written with a raw, desperate vulnerability that contrasts sharply with the cold, calculated tone of the manuscript. If the letter is true, then the heroic Jeremy who protected his family is actually a man who tried to kill his wife based on a creative writing exercise. Even worse, it means Lowen handed a man a death warrant for a woman who was actually a grieving, terrified mother. The chapter ends with Lowen hearing Jeremy's footsteps on the stairs. He's coming up to check on her, his voice full of the gentle, husbandly concern she has grown to love. But now, that voice sounds like a threat. Lowen is faced with an impossible choice. Does she believe the manuscript, which justified her actions, or the letter, which makes her a murderer? She has seconds to decide what to do with the paper in her hand before Jeremy enters the room. Chapter: Dear Jeremy. The Dear Jeremy chapter is the full, uninterrupted text of the letter Lowen found under the floorboards. It serves as the ultimate he said, she said of the novel, written by Verity in a frantic, desperate hand, just days before the accident that ended her life. In this letter, Verity speaks directly to Jeremy, but also to anyone who might find it if she doesn't survive. She explains that the So Be It manuscript was never a memoir. It was a therapeutic tool recommended by her editor to help her deal with intrusive thoughts and the paralyzing grief of the twins' deaths. She calls it antagonistic journaling, a process where she wrote the most repulsive, villainous version of herself on the page so that she could leave those dark feelings there and be a sane mother to Crew in real life. She swears on her life that she never harmed Harper or Chastine, and that the confessions in the manuscript were purely fictional exercises in horror. The letter then shifts into a narrative of terror. Verity describes the moment Jeremy found the manuscript. She says she saw a look in his eyes she had never seen before, a cold, murderous rage. She claims that the car accident wasn't an accident at all. She says Jeremy intentionally drove them into that tree to kill her because he believed the manuscript was real. When she survived, she realized she was trapped. She knew that if she woke up in the hospital, Jeremy would find another way to finish her off. She admits she began faking the chronic vegetative state out of a primal need to stay alive and stay near Crew, hoping that eventually she could find a way to escape with her son. Verity describes the psychological torture of her months in that bed. She writes about the agony of hearing Jeremy flirt with Lowen, the pain of being handled like an object by the nurse, and the sheer willpower it took to remain limp while her husband looked at her with nothing but hatred. She ends the letter by stating that if Jeremy is reading this, it means she is likely dead, and she begs him to look at the real her, the woman who loved him, rather than the character she created in a notebook. The letter leaves the reader with a devastating realization. If Verity is telling the truth, then the manuscript was art, and the heroic Jeremy is actually a man who attempted murder and then successfully committed it with Lowen's help. Verity, by Colleen Hoover. Chapter 25. Chapter 25 is the chilling resolution to Lowen's journey, and it centers entirely on the agonizing moral crossroads she faces after reading the Dear Jeremy letter. As she stands in the cramped, dark closet of the Vermont house, the paper feels like it's burning her skin. She is forced to reevaluate every single interaction she has had with Jeremy since she arrived. If Verity's letter is the truth, then Lowen hasn't been a victim of a haunting. She has been the catalyst for a cold-blooded execution. She looks at the handwriting, the frantic, desperate loops of a woman who claimed she was playing a part to survive, and compares it to the cold, clinical, so be it entries. The realization that she can never truly know which one was the real Verity sends her into a physical state of nausea. When Jeremy finally enters the room, the tension is suffocating. Lowen has to make a split-second decision that will define the rest of her life. She looks at Jeremy, the man who is currently the picture of a devoted partner and father, and she tries to reconcile him with the man Verity described. the man who allegedly steered a car into a tree with the intent to kill his wife. She realizes that if she shows him the letter, their lives are over. If Jeremy is innocent, the guilt of what he did to Verity based on a writing exercise will destroy his mind. If he is guilty, then by showing him the letter, Lowen is essentially telling a murderer that she knows his secret. In that moment, the safety of her unborn child becomes her primary compass. Lowen decides to perform. Just as Verity performed for months in that bed, Lowen begins her own charade. She hides the letter and greets Jeremy with the same warmth she has used for the last 7 months. She watches him move through the house, helping the movers and checking on crew, and she realizes that they are now a family built entirely on a foundation of necessary lies. The irony is staggering. She moved to Vermont to finish Verity's books, but she has ended up living a life that is more scripted and deceptive than any of the fiction she has ever written. The destruction of the letter is the most significant act of the chapter. By tearing it into tiny pieces and disposing of it, Lowen isn't just getting rid of paper, she is choosing her reality. She chooses to believe the manuscript because she has to. To believe the letter is to admit she is a monster. She watches the remnants of Verity's alternative truth disappear, effectively silencing Verity for the final time. She realizes that the only way to survive is to be the one who controls the narrative. She is no longer just the co-writer of the Villains series. She is the curator of the Crawford family legacy. As they finally pull away from the house for the last time, Lowen looks back at the darkening windows. She feels a profound sense of loss, not for Verity, but for her own sense of morality. She is leaving the house with the man she loves and the son she has helped raise, but she is also carrying a secret that will forever sit between her and Jeremy. The book ends not with a sense of peace, but with a lingering, haunting question. Did she save a family from a villain, or did she help a villain eliminate his last obstacle? As they drive toward their new life, Lowen understands that she will spend the rest of her days wondering if the man sitting in the driver's seat is a hero or the most dangerous person she has ever met.